Hi. Hello. My name is Stephanie, and welcome, or if you've been back, welcome back. Either way, I'm glad you're here, and I hope you're well. And today we're continuing our journey into the Dollenganger Saga by V.C. Andrews with the second book in the original series, Petals on the Wind by V.C. Andrews. I don't think I need to say that, but I did anyway. Or as I like to call it, all the men in Cathy's life are trash. Yes, all of them. So spoilers for both Petals on the Wind and Flowers in the Attic because we're going to be referencing events from the former, as well as very, very mild spoilers for the 2014 movie adaptation of Petals on the Wind. The plan is to talk about all the adaptations of the Dollenganger series sometime in the very distant future, but there are some adaptational changes that I want to talk about that are relevant here, so kind of very mild spoiler warning. And also, content warning for SA, reference child abuse, child neglect, CSA, food insecurity, intimate partner violence, incest, suicide, and elder abuse. As you can see, this continues to be a lot, and that will continue to be a thing for the rest of the series moving forward. Before we get into all this, I want to talk about something called the present absence. This is a trope where a character is not present for one reason or another, yet that presence is not only felt within the story, but it has a massive effect on the characters and the story as a whole. Basically, their absence drives the plot either directly or because of the effect their absence has on characters in the story. If you've heard the term haunting the narrative before, where a character has either died or left the story, but remains in the story in some form, be it as a memory, a symbol, the consequences and effect of their death or departure, they still very much affect the characters and the story. It's very similar. Think Charlie from Hereditary, Claudia from Interview with the Vampire, the TV series, Mulder's sister Samantha in The X-Files, Suguru Geto in Jujutsu Kaisen, I said what I said, and Yoichi Shigaraki in My Hero Academia, I said what I said, and for our purposes today, Corey Dollenganger in the Dollenganger series. In my last video, that in my opinion, Corey's death is the most important moment in the series. His death, that loss, that awful, cruel loss, is the catalyst for everything that comes after, and you feel his loss, that absence, throughout the rest of the series. But his ghost, figurative ghost, not literal, is very present in Petals on the Wind. Corey is not present, but my God, is his absence felt, and the loss of him has absolutely devastating consequences, not just for his siblings that were left behind and the mother who killed him, but for everyone in their orbit. So keep all that in mind. And let's talk Petals on the Wind. I'm just going to jump right into it, so not to shamelessly self-promote or anything like that, but you should definitely watch the video about Flowers in the Attic for an overly long summary of that, because we're literally just going to jump right into it from this point forward. It is November 1960 at this point. Corey died just before Halloween 1960 for your reference, and Petals on the Wind picks up immediately after the end of Flowers in the Attic. And we find the three surviving Dollenganger children continuing their journey to Florida, and they are currently on a bus traveling through North Carolina. However, Carrie, weak and sick from a really just god-awful combination of grief and literal arsenic poisoning, gets violently ill and starts throwing up all over the place. And the other passengers are, of course, sympathetic to a sick, crying, scared little girl who looks like she's been through literal hell. Just kidding. They immediately start calling for the kids to be thrown off the bus in the middle of nowhere in North Carolina. And kids who are alone and sick and having escaped being imprisoned and abused for 3 freaking years are absolutely terrified that not only are they going to be stranded, but that Carrie is dying after having just lost their brother. Help comes in the form of Henny Beach, an older woman with mutism who communicates through ASL and writing in a notebook, who shames the other passengers for treating the kids like that and even helps clean Carrie up. She also realizes that there's something very, very wrong with Chris, Kathy, and Carrie, who are all very pale, very clearly malnourished, alone, and wearing ill-fitting clothing. And Carrie is very clearly deathly ill, so she offers to take the kids with her when she gets to her stop, as she is the housekeeper for a small-town doctor named Paul Sheffield, aka the reason I have trust issues, but we'll get to that. Although they're initially hesitant, afraid that police will be called and they'll be separated or worse, returned to Foxworth Hall, the fear of losing Carrie outweighs that and they agree to go with Henny. So, okay, let me preface what I'm about to say by saying this. I adore Henny. I do. He's a kind and sweet character, and she literally saves Carrie's life, and probably Chris and Kathy's lives too, by standing up for them on that bus. I adore Henny. That being said, there are two POC characters in the Dollenganger series who both appear in this book, in Petals on the Wind. Henny, who is a black woman, and Yolanda Lang, I don't think I'm saying her last name right, who is half Arab. And they both fall into some really harmful tropes. The Mammy, which I feel gross even just saying. For Henny, characters who fall into this trope are typically middle-aged black women who work in domestic roles for very wealthy white families. Think a maid, a cook, a nanny. And again, like I said, Henny very much falls into this. And then there's Yolanda, who we meet much later in the story, who is very much over-sexualized and exoticized. It's just kind of weird and gross to me, the extent to which this is done with her character. I linked some articles about both tropes below and why they're harmful, if you want to read up more on them in a more in-depth explanation than I just gave right here. Like I said, we don't meet Yolanda until much later, but I wanted to touch on this aspect of the book before we move forward. So Henny takes the three kids to Paul's house. He's in his 40s, he's very handsome, successful, practices medicine nearby, and lives in a massive, very beautiful house alone, save for Henny. And he's horrified at the state the kids are in, especially Carrie. Chris and Kathy try to convince Paul that she just randomly got sick after eating some food at a diner, but he can tell that this is not food poisoning, it's not norovirus, it's something else. But again, that fear of being discovered keeps them from telling him what happened to them. But Paul knows they're lying, and he can see they've been through something horrible, and they need to tell him what happened so that he can treat Carrie. So Kathy, reluctantly, tells him an abridged version of the last 3 years. The abuse at the hands of their grandmother, the imprisonment in the attic, being abandoned by Corinne, and the arsenic poisoning. She does not tell them about Corey. She does this partially out of fear of being put into the foster care system and separated from her siblings, but also because of Chris. Because despite everything she has done to them, a part of him still wants to protect Corinne. And Kathy can see that on his face. And as much as she hates Corinne, she loves Chris more. So she leaves out the literal murder. I thought bitterly, don't worry, I'll protect your precious mother as much as I can. I think Chris understood, for tears came into his eyes. Oh, how much that woman had done to hurt him, hurt all of us, and he could still cry for her sake. His tears put tears in my heart too, not for her, but for him, who'd loved her so well, and for me, who loved him so well, and tears for all we'd suffered and shared. It is not hot enough for Corinne. Is, as any person would be, horrified by this and wants to go to the police for, again, very obvious reasons. But Kathy refuses that, telling him, "So you see, doctor," I said to finish, "you can't force us to go to the police and tell our story. They might throw the grandmother and our mother in jail, but we'd suffer too. Not only from the publicity, but from being separated. They'd put us in foster homes or make us wards of the court, and we've sworn to stay together. Always." Chris begs Paul to help Carrie and says they'll find a way to repay him for helping her, but Paul points out that while Carrie is definitely suffering more severe effects, that both he and Kathy were fed arsenic for weeks and need medical tests done, not to mention all three of them are malnourished and need care and treatment, so he offers to take them in. Chris is reluctant, but Kathy wants to stay, and Paul tells them that while he can't stop them from leaving, that Carrie needs prolonged care and can't travel. They should at least stay until she's well enough to do that if they're absolutely convinced that they have to leave. Paul, Chris, and Kathy come to an arrangement. They'll stay with him while he treats them and Carrie heals, and as a way to repay him, though he doesn't really want repayment, but at their insistence, they will help him around the house. That's the way it started. We moved quickly into the doctor's home and into his life. We took him over. I know that now. We made ourselves important to him, as if he hadn't had a life before we came. I know that now too. He made it seem like we were doing him a favor by relieving him of a dreary, lonely life by adding our youthful presence. He made us feel that we were being generous to share his life, and oh, how we did want to believe in someone. And I have such trust issues because of the character of Paul. He seems like such a great guy. You know, he takes these kids in, he's caring for them, he's being a father figure to them. Put a pin in that. because you're all about to be as sad as I was, maybe. We eventually learn that Paul is a widower, whose wife and young son died some years earlier. The implication at this point is that they died in an accident together. And he's never remarried and is kind of estranged from his own family, though they live in the same small town. So he's glad to have a company. Put a pin in all that. Put a giant pin in all that. Like I said, I liked Paul. I trusted Paul. I thought he was this nice guy. It's been years and I'm still mad about Paul, but we're going to get to that because I'm going to harp on it. And under Paul and Henny's care, the kids start to thrive and they start to heal physically, but the trauma they've suffered at the hands of their mother and grandmother hangs heavy over them. Despite Paul's house having 12 rooms, Cathy and Carrie share a room, and there is this severe anxiety as Chris is going to have his own room. They're going to be in separate rooms for the first time in over 3 years, and that's a struggle for them. Cathy also starts hoarding food. She hides canned goods in a can opener under her bed so that no one can ever starve them again. This is a common trauma response for people that have suffered food insecurity that sometimes develops. And although they initially intended to leave as soon as Carrie was well enough to travel, she loves being with Paul and Henny, finally having 2 adults who love and care for her for the first time since her father was alive. You know, a father that she barely remembers. That's absolutely no disrespect to Chris and Cathy. They loved and cared for the twins as best that they could, but they were literal children. And Carrie wants to stay, so in the end, they stay with Paul. And again, they start thriving living with him. Henny teaches Carrie and Cathy how to bake and to cook and how to sew. Chris often shadows Paul during his medical practice. They get an allowance. They have chores. Paul is going to send them to school after Christmas. All 3 of them learn ASL to communicate with Henny. They have a roof over their heads. They can go outside and play. They have sunlight and fresh air. They are being fed. No one is regularly telling them that they are evil and going to hell, or beating them or actively trying to kill them. Like I said, hell is really not hot enough for Corinne and Olivia. Couple weeks pass. We are almost to Christmas at this point. It is Christmas 1960, about, for your reference, and Paul decides that he wants to make the arrangement official and make the kids his wards, and he wants to do this legally, which leads to one of the most heartbreaking moments in the entire series. Basically, Paul would need their parents' consent to make them his wards. Since Christopher Sr. is dead, all he really needs is Corinne's consent. So he petitions the courts to get Corinne to come to a hearing regarding the custody of the kids. And all 5 of them, the 3 kids, Paul and Henny, attend the hearing, and Corinne never shows. She never even responds. This rejection is devastating, because despite everything that happened, everything she's done to them, as much as Cathy hates her, a part of her hoped that Corinne would at least show up. You know, even if she came there and lied and just gave the kids up, that she would at least show up. I kind of think that part of Cathy hoped that Corinne would not just show up, but that she'd beg for their forgiveness, or that there would be some sort of explanation for it all. And yet, she didn't. Corinne has abandoned them again. This realization that she wants nothing to do with them, that complete strangers give more of a damn about them than their own mother, is devastating. And this only makes Cathy angrier. And me, if we're being honest. How could a stranger come so easily into our lives and give us love when our own blood kin had sought to give us death? I mentioned at the very, very end of my Flowers in the Attic video that we see the split in how Chris and Cathy deal with their trauma when they debate about going to the police after they escape Foxworth Hall. Cathy wants to go full scorched earth. She wants Corinne and Olivia to pay for what they did to them. She wants to ruin them. Whereas Chris just wants to let them go, let this go, and move on with their lives. Not forget, because they could never forget, and not forgive, because there's no forgiving any of that, but to just let it go. And we really see this in Petals on the Wind, much more so, because Chris, despite the pain that he's in, does his very best to leave their past behind. Cathy goes the other way with that. She goes the other way hard with that. With her allowance, she gets a subscription to the Charlottesville paper. Charlottesville, if you remember, is where Foxworth Hall is. So she can keep up with Bart and Corinne's escapades in the society pages where they are often featured. And much to her chagrin, they are out there seemingly living their best lives, going to lavish parties, throwing equally lavish parties, remodeling Foxworth Hall, traveling the world. All while Corey is dead, and the 3 kids that are left are trying to pick up the pieces and scrape together some semblance of a normal life. It's not fair. Cathy is not just going to let Corinne forget them. So unbeknownst to anyone, she starts writing Corinne letters. Vaguely threatening letters. She never threatens to hurt Corinne or Olivia physically, but the letters are very, very unnerving. And listen, I support women's rights and women's wrongs, and as someone who, if there's one thing I'm going to do, it's hold a grudge. I will in fact heal in hell. I get it. This is a joke, by the way. I'm not advocating for sending threatening letters to people, just so we're clear. Corinne never responds to any of these letters, but the letters never get returned either. For your reference, Cathy never names herself in any of these letters or indicates that it's her, at least at this point in time. That's important for later, put a pin in that. For as good as things are going, Chris graduates high school early and is going to college. Carrie is happy with Henny and Paul and going to a prestigious private school, and Cathy has an audition with a local ballet company. Also at this point, that Chris stops using the name Dollenganger and starts using Paul's last name, Sheffield. Cathy keeps going by Dollenganger, eventually shortening it to Doll, because when she gets famous, her dream is to become a famous ballet dancer. She wants Corinne to know it's her. Put a pin in that. Put a pin in Chris using the name Sheffield. Put a pin in that. We're going to come back to that at the very end. They're still very much not okay, as well as things that are going. And even though, in my opinion, Flowers in the Attic is the best book in the original series, I think Petals on the Wind is just as strong of a book. It is this, at times, very stark and heartbreaking look at the aftermath of trauma and trying to cope with something absolutely devastating that irrevocably changes you. Carrie anguishes over Corey's death, her mother's rejection, the damage to her self-esteem that her grandmother did, and her guilt at surviving when her twin died. And that's to say nothing of her lingering health issues. She never grows to her full height. Her growth was permanently stunted, and she continues to have health issues for the rest of her life. Cathy and Chris struggle with much of the same things, as well as what happened between them and their lingering feelings and desire for each other. And as much as they tell themselves and each other that what happened between them will never happen again now that they are free and out of the attic, they cannot keep things platonic between them and often have various, we'll say, less than platonic encounters with one another. So after Christmas, Cathy has her audition for a prestigious local ballet school that is run by a husband and wife, Marisha and George's Rosenkopf, who have since retired from professional dancing and have taught many famous dancers since their retirement and moving into a teaching role. So they are very, very sought after. They also used to be quite famous, we find out. We're going to talk more about them a little bit later, but for our purposes at this moment in time, that's all you need to know. So this is also where I'm going to give a more specific content warning for some kind of graphic content and speculations about miscarriage. So there's a time skip in the pinned comment should you need to do that. So Cathy's audition is going incredibly well. She very much impresses Marisha and George's, but sadly while she's dancing, Cathy starts bleeding. Like she starts hemorrhaging blood to the point where she passes out from blood loss and wakes up in a hospital sometimes later. And she's terrified that she got pregnant from Chris's assault in the attic, but he's quick to reassure her that it was due to her having an irregular menstrual cycle, which has been an issue for her since she started having it because of the starvation they suffered in the attic. Again, this is not uncommon for people who have suffered food insecurity, but Cathy is terrified that it was actually a miscarriage despite the reassurances. I hate to say it, but put a pin in that too. Put a pin in that too, because that gets real freaking weird later in the book. Put a pin in it, I hate to say. But she does get into the ballet school, so there's that. So while Chris and Cathy are struggling with their shame and guilt, as well as their continued sexual and romantic desire for each other, at the same time, they both long for a normal life and are struggling with the increasing and devastating realization that because of what happened to them, they're very much irrevocably changed, and there's no going back. They're never going to be the same kids who walked into that attic, no matter how much they would like to be. And this is a devastating and very hard realization that they're coming to. This is Cathy reflecting on what it's like, finally going to high school and feeling, like an outsider. I didn't like being different. I wanted to be like the others. And though I tried, I found out I was different. How could it be otherwise? She had made me different. Despite their feelings for each other, Cathy ultimately rejects Chris and tells him that they need to find other people to love romantically. But Chris tells Cathy there is never going to be anyone for him but her. Because other than Carrie, Cathy is literally the only person who will ever truly understand what happened to them. The two of them, Chris and Cathy, are so bound by their shared trauma, there can never be anyone for them but each other. This isn't romantic. I think the way these books kind of are unfairly painted, this is horribly tragic. It's horribly tragic. After Christmas, Chris leaves for med school and Carrie goes to a local boarding school. We're going to talk more about Carrie's time at school later, so put a pin in that. And this is where we're going to talk about the 2014 movie as well. So, with the exception of the third novel, all the books in the original Dollenganger series are narrated by Cathy. Everything that we see is from her point of view. So we don't know much about Chris's time in med school. We know that he does incredibly well academically and gets a prestigious residency, and that's kind of it. In the movie, we spend a little bit more time with Chris at med school. Not very much, but we do spend some. And he actually gets a girlfriend, a desperate attempt to get over Cathy, something that ends in absolute disaster. And I like that we get to see at least some of what Chris's life looked like away from his sisters. And I wish we gotten to see that in the book, because as much as he is desperately trying to forget what happened to them and to move on with his life, no matter how hard he tries, he can't. And no matter how hard he tries, he can't forget what happened to them either. Cathy really struggles with being away from her siblings with whom she spent 3 years surviving something unimaginable with. One of them she essentially raised like her own child, on top of feeling like an outcast among her peers at the high school she attends and at the ballet company. No matter what she does, she can't relate. And she hates feeling like a perpetual outsider. She's lonely. And she and Paul begin to grow closer. Do you see where this is going? Now, let me preface this next bit by saying this. What happens isn't Cathy's fault. She is a child. She is a traumatized child who is literally his ward, and Paul is an adult. Paul is older than I am, and as soon as Paul realized what was going on, he should have stopped it. But reading this again as an adult, I noticed that Paul definitely had some feelings. I hate to call it that. For lack of a better word, we'll go with that. Feelings for Cathy. He often stares at her in a way that is definitely not paternal. With Chris and Carrie gone, both away at school, Cathy is so desperate for any kind of love and affection because, again, she is a traumatized child who, in my opinion, doesn't know how to deal with those feelings and honestly probably hasn't, at this point anyway, even begun to process what happened to her in the attic, and struggling with her feelings for her brother and the shame that comes along with those feelings, starts trying to seduce Paul, who can't seem to decide whether he thinks of her as a child or as a grown woman. I'm going to be nice and help him out here and tell him that she's definitely a child. Just helping a guy out, I guess. And one night, after drinking a little too much, Paul confronts Cathy about her relationship with Chris, which, reading this as an adult, kind of seems like he might be jealous of Chris, which I'm not even qualified to unpack, so we're going to move past that, because he and Cathy have never been as subtle as they thought. Cathy is horrified and guilt-ridden about this and is terrified Paul is going to hate her, which he assures her that he doesn't. This goes back and forth for a while, and it's kind of portrayed as a will they, won't they thing, which I don't love. Eventually, one night, Paul tells Cathy the real story about his wife and son, Julia and Scotty. The implication before, like I said, was that they died in an accident. I kind of thought they died in a car accident. Paul reveals that he and Julia always had a very, very troubled relationship, as she was a victim of CSA, and it seems like she was either sex repulsed or asexual as a result of that trauma, so she did not like sex. So Paul frequently forced himself on her. Yeah. After she gets pregnant with their son, Julia refuses to let him anywhere near her, so he starts cheating on her with anything with a pulse. Yeah. Eventually, he had a years-long affair with his secretary, which Julia discovered and confronted him about, promising that she'd make him pay. So on Scotty's 3rd birthday, Julia took her son and drowned them both in a nearby lake. Put a pin in that because, believe it or not, that gets so much worse. It's come to a head one day when Cathy is out running an errand for Madame Marisha and ends up seeing her mother and Bart while she's picking something up in town. And Cathy freezes. She wants to scream and rage at her, but she also wants to throw herself at her mother because that's her mom and she's a kid. And this is so heartbreaking. And Corinne never even notices her. And I think that this is a catalyst for what happens because not long after encounter with Bart and Corinne, Cathy and Paul start sleeping together. Again, that is just my theory. Do with it what you will. But I think after this rejection, with Corinne not even noticing her and her anger that Corinne is out here living her very best life while her children are struggling with the damage she did to them, is what drives Cathy into Paul's arms. Because again, she is a traumatized kid looking for love, also struggling with a lot of guilt and shame relating to her sexuality. Not just because of her feelings for Chris, but because of the constant emotional and religious abuse at Olivia's hands. Long after Cathy and Paul get together, I hate wording it like that, but that's kind of the best way to describe it. Not long after they get together, and when Chris is home for the summer, Carrie has since left boarding school and is attending school locally for your reference, but like I said, we'll get to the why of that later. Cathy demands that they go visit Foxworth Hall, which they reluctantly do. But she doesn't get any closure from this or any peace, and Carrie becomes hysterical, crying out for her mama, and it breaks my heart. Because after everything, she's still just this little kid who wants her mom. So they leave soon after, but again, Foxworth Hall and what happens to them still very much hangs heavy over them in everything that they do. It is the ghost that haunts them and will be for the rest of their lives. For the last year, it's been about a year since Paul took the kids in, so it's 1961 for your reference. Cathy has been attending the local ballet school run by Georges and Marisha, and she's thriving, and she's caught the attention of a frequent visitor to the school, Julian Rosenkopf, Marissa and George's son, who dances under the name Julian Marquette, because he wants to make it under his own talent rather than his father's name. And Julian is incredibly talented. He works as a professional ballet dancer in New York City. He's also very handsome, very charming, very condescending, and very controlling. And he soon develops an obsession with Cathy, and the two begin seeing each other very casually, what the youth today might call a situationship, I guess, during which he constantly pressures and even tries to force Cathy to sleep with him. Like I said, all the men in her life are trash. Julian also wants Cathy to come to New York City with him and be his dance partner because they work very well together, and he thinks that she'd thrive in New York City. This is where we will meet Yolanda. She's a dancer in the company whose only personality traits are that she's jealous of Cathy and sleeps around. And even after Cathy officially breaks things off with Julian when she and Paul get together officially, Julian never stops trying to convince her to come to New York City with him. Eventually, Cathy does end up agreeing with Julian because she'll have much more opportunities for advancing in her ballet career in a bigger city and a better company, and that's just kind of a fact. So she ends up going with him. But despite the fact that she's seeing someone and tells Julian this frequently, his obsession with her not only continues, but gets even worse as he starts insisting that they should get married, which totally definitely wouldn't be an extremely toxic mess. Foreshadowing. Why does Cathy put up with Julian? Yeah, he's talented and they dance phenomenally together, but surely that wouldn't balance out everything else. He tries to control her, screams at her, makes her cry, flies off the handle at very slight things. Why put up with all that? Well, throughout the novel, we learn from Julian that he is the 13th in a long line of Russian ballet dancers. And his parents, like I said, were very famous, but had to stop dancing professionally after he was born, and thus there's some resentment towards him, and they both, but especially his father, held Julian to some insanely high standards, and nothing he did was ever good enough for them. And on top of that, he was often verbally abused and neglected and possibly even physically abused by his parents, which Cathy very much relates to. And I think she feels a kind of kinship with him as she was also an abused child, and thus she doesn't want to leave and abandon him because she knows what that feels like and doesn't want to do that to another person. On top of that, Julian is the one who took her to New York City, where she's dancing with a professional company and getting closer to her dream of being a famous prima ballerina. So I think there's an added feeling of obligation to him, which, to get up on my soapbox for a moment, just because someone does something nice for you doesn't mean you owe them anything, especially if they treat you like garbage. On a visit home for Christmas after her first year in New York City, Paul proposes to Cathy, and the two are engaged. It is what it is, folks. After some very successful and very well-received shows, the New York City company gets invited to do a live taping of Romeo and Juliet with Julian and Cathy in the title roles, and it's a huge success. However, after the show, Cathy is approached by an older woman who she initially mistakes for a fan. But this isn't just a fan, it's Amanda Sheffield, Paul's older sister, who tells Cathy that it's super creepy that Paul is engaged to his former child ward because, yeah, she's right, that's creepy. Cathy gets very defensive and tells Amanda that they're in love and she is an adult, which she technically is at this point. But Amanda points out that, yeah, she is now, but she, Amanda, knows that they were sleeping together when she was a minor because Cathy had an abortion just after Christmas, and that Paul kept the embryo from the abortion, which would have been twins, but since the embryo didn't properly separate, it ended up having two heads. And before Cathy or us can even begin to process any of that, again, I read these books in 8th grade, that was a lot. Before Cathy can even process any of that Chris got her pregnant, that she had a miscarriage, that Paul and Chris seemingly lied to her, and the guilt and the anger and the shame that comes along with all of that, Cathy tells her, well, you can't get married anyway, because Paul is still married, which Cathy is confused by, because no, Paul is a widower. And that's when Amanda tells her that Julia, Paul's wife, is alive, and has been the whole time, but she's been confined to a mental institution, and has been in a catatonic state since she killed Scotty, but she is very much alive, so Paul is very much still married. She even has pictures of Julia as she continued to visit her. Amanda tells Cathy not to marry Paul and that she deserves someone better. Again, points were made. So before we get into the fallout of all this, because oh my god, there is some pretty significant fallout to it, as you can imagine. Why did Amanda do this? And was any of it true? So, full disclosure, I'm going to get a little tinfoil hat-ish in this bit, but just stay with me, okay? So, I don't think that this was something altruistic that Amanda did. Not entirely, anyway. Rather, I think that she was upset about how this was making her family look, because she straight up tells Cathy, he wears a hair shirt, doesn't he? She, Amanda, asked in a gloating way, her dark, pretty eyes glowing with satisfaction. He tortures himself, blames himself, longs for his son, and then you came along and he put a baby in you. Don't think the whole town doesn't know about your abortion. We know. We know everything. That line about the whole town knowing is significant in my opinion, because Paul and Amanda live in the same small town. I lived in a small town for more than a decade, and everyone talks about everyone. So imagine if your brother started hooking up with and gets engaged to this barely legal girl he'd been raising, and there's a rumor that he helped her end a pregnancy when she was a minor, after the probably not insignificant scandal that Scotty's death probably resulted in. I think Amanda is more worried about her reputation than she is about Cathy. However, she's also not wrong about some things. Paul dating, sleeping with, and getting engaged to a teenager just this side of legal, who was his ward, is weird. That is weird. And Cathy is an adult at this point in our story, yeah, but it's still really freaking weird. Is any of this true? I think at least partially. Again, I'm going to get a little tinfoil hat-ish, but again, stay with me. So when Cathy confronts Paul about all this, he says that Julia died not long after he took the kids in. I think this is a lie. During the time period Cathy was trying to seduce Paul, I feel so gross saying that, he sometimes gets home very late and misses dinner because of various medical conferences. I think he was with Julia. And I think when they finally got together, just after his birthday, that was when Julia actually died. So I think she is dead when Amanda comes to confront Kathy. But I don't think she was dead the whole time, like Paul says. Now, what about Kathy's possible miscarriage? I go back and forth with this one. The procedure she had in the book is what is referred to by several characters as a D&C, which, to greatly oversimplify it, because I'm not a doctor, is a procedure where tissue is removed from the uterus. Now this, according to some reading I did, can be used to treat an incomplete miscarriage. However, it can also be used to treat heavy menstrual bleeding, which is what both Paul and Chris say that she had. So maybe, but I also think it's possible that Paul lied to Chris, who in turn lied to Kathy, to protect them both. This depends on when you ask me, but I genuinely think it can go either way. Paul does admit to having a two-headed embryo, but he claims that it was like a gag gift or like a gross-out gift that somebody gave him in med school, and I don't know. I guess I do think it's possible that Paul and Chris are telling the truth, but I also think it is possible that Kathy did in fact have a miscarriage. I don't know. Like I said, I go back and forth with that one. It kind of depends on when you ask me. On to the fallout. Kathy is absolutely shattered by this because it's confirmation of her very worst fear, that she is everything their grandmother said she was. She is evil. She is devil spawn. On top of that, Paul, who saved them, who loved Kathy, Paul lied to her, just like Corinne did. So shortly after the taping, and after her world is literally shattered by Amanda, Kathy, Julian, and the rest of the company go on tour in Europe, and Julian proposes to Kathy at a party, and she accepts. They get married not long after. She never tells her family any of this. They find out that she's married from a newspaper article, and when they go home after their tour, partially to visit Kathy's family, but also because Julian's father is ill and on his deathbed, Kathy finally confronts Paul, who tells her that Julia died not long after the kids came to live with him, which I don't believe, and again reassures Kathy that she never had a miscarriage. So Kathy realizes that Amanda lied to her and that she made a huge mistake in marrying Julian, but Kathy decides to stick with it. She resolves to stay with him and make their marriage work. Almost as soon as they get married, however, Julian starts abusing Kathy. He assaults her, he hits her, he steals from her, he cheats on her, he controls her, he isolates her from her friends and family. He refuses to let her attend Chris's med school graduation. She literally has to drug him and sneak out of the house to attend it. And while she's gone, Julian destroys every single thing Kathy owns in their apartment, and even gets her kicked out of the lead role of their upcoming ballet, Giselle. Chris and Kathy return to New York City and learn about all this. They don't learn about the damage he did to their apartment until later, but they learn that he got her kicked out of the role in their ballet and go to confront him about it, and Chris insisted on going with her because he can see that she's in a bad situation. When Kathy confronts Julian about all this, he actually jumps on her feet with both of his with so much force that he breaks several of her toes, which gets him fired from the ballet company, and he ends up running off with Yolanda. While taking care of Kathy after she's released from the emergency room, it's when they go home later that night that they see the damage that Julian did to their apartment. Chris tells Kathy that she needs to leave Julian, valid and correct, and to be with him. Instead, her that they can go somewhere where no one will know their siblings and they can live as husband and wife. This is significantly less valid. And while she's tempted, Kathy reveals that she's pregnant, which is not a deal breaker for Chris. He's like, no big deal. I'll raise the child with you and we can tell everyone that I'm the father because no one will know we're brother and sister. This is so horribly sad to me. I feel so horribly bad for them in this moment, and while Kathy admits that sometimes this is all she wants, that the only time she can imagine herself happy is with Chris and their twins, because they're so traumatized and damaged by their years in captivity and the abuse that they endured, that yet Kathy is terrified of repeating their parents' mistakes and turning into their mother. This is one of her greatest fears. Yet again, rejects Chris. Also incest bad. And she does genuinely love Paul, so she doesn't want to be with anyone else. A few hours later, the police call and tell Cathy that Julian and Yolanda were in a car accident. He was driving drunk, and Yolanda is dead. And Julian, while alive, is in critical condition. They get to the hospital and learn that Julian's neck is broken, and his spinal cord is in kind of shock, I guess. And when he eventually wakes up, he's convinced he's paralyzed and will never dance again, and therefore has no reason to live. Cathy tries to convince him otherwise, and he says that she never loved him, that their marriage is toxic, and they were bad for each other. He's not wrong about that, but he's horribly cruel to her and really unapologetic about the way that he's treated her. Kind of last-ditch effort to convince him to keep living, Cathy tells Julian that she's pregnant and beg him to live for their child if he can't live for himself. This is right after Cathy tells Julian that she's pregnant. He rolled his dark, shining eyes my way, and I saw the way they shone, for they were full of tears. Tears of self-pity or tears of frustration, I didn't know. But he spoke more kindly, and there was a tone of love in his voice. I advise you to get rid of it, Cathy. 14 is no luckier a number than 14. Not long after that, Julian tampers with his IV and takes his own life. Cathy moves back to Paul's house with Chris and gives birth to her son, Jory, named for both Julian and Corey. It is 1969 at this point, for your reference, and things are good. Everyone dotes on Jory. Chris is excelling in his residency. Harry has graduated high school at this point and has started working for Paul as his private secretary. Cathy and her son are surrounded by people that she loves the most, yet Cathy isn't entirely at peace. Paul and Chris are both fighting for her attention and to be Jory's father. Chris is still trying to convince Cathy to run away with him and just live as husband and wife somewhere where no one knows them. She lost Julian. She sees how Carrie is struggling with her self-esteem, and her mother is still out there living her best life while they've gone through so much. And on top of it all, Cathy is deeply in debt. Julian ran up huge bills when he was alive, and then there's his and Cathy's hospital bills, not to mention her having to provide for her child. When Jory is a couple of years old, I think he's about 2.5, 3 years old, Cathy takes him and Carrie and rents a small cottage somewhere between Foxworth Hall and Paul's house, so she's right in between the two. She also ends up taking over a small ballet school when the former teacher retires, and Cathy, having been a formerly famous ballet dancer, she didn't quite reach prima ballerina status, but she was still quite famous, ends up being a really sought-after teacher. This is also the point where Cathy starts actively blackmailing her mother, and she ends up sending Corinne a letter telling her what's happened and what she's gone through and that she needs money, not unlike Corinne did with her own mother all those years ago. And unlike the vaguely threatening letters that she's been continuing to send over the years, she actually ends up signing this one. After many futile attempts, I came up with what I believed the perfect letter of extortion. This is the letter. Dear Mrs. Winslow, once upon a Gladstone, Pennsylvania time, there lived a man and wife who had 4 children, everyone referred to as the Dresden dolls. Now one of the dolls lies in a lonely grave, and another of the dolls fails to grow to the height that should have been hers if she'd been given sunlight and fresh air and the love that a mother owed her when she needed it most. Now the ballerina doll has a small son of her own and not much money. I know, Mrs. Winslow, that you don't have compassion for children who might cast a shadow over your sunny days, so I will come directly to the point. The ballerina doll demands payment of $1 million if you are to keep your millions or billions. You may send the amount to the post office box I name, and be assured, Mrs. Winslow, that if you fail to do so, the ears of Mr. Bartholomew Winslow, attorney at law, will be filled with horror tales that I'm sure you'd rather he not hear. Cordially yours, the ballerina doll, Catherine Dollenganger Marquette. Again, no one ever responds, and after many letters and many weeks, it's on to plan B, seduce her mother's husband. So Cathy makes an appointment to see Bart under the guise of wanting to sue Julian's insurance company, who are refusing to pay out as he technically committed suicide, which violates the insurance term, trying to use that as an excuse not to pay her what they owe her. He is genuinely shocked to learn that Bart knows who she is, because Corinne followed her career avidly. Bart tells her that Corinne is a huge ballet fan and was a particular fan of Cathy's. Corinne is actually out of the country. She's at a spa in Europe at the moment. We actually find out later that she is getting some plastic surgery done. This is an interesting idea that I think the book touches on, just how desperately Corinne is trying to cling to her youth and beauty by visiting all these spas and having all these cosmetics procedures done. I think that's a very, very interesting thing that it touches on. But even though she's away, the renovations at Foxworth Hall are being completed, and Bart is intrigued by Cathy, so he takes the case and actually ends up winning. He's a very good lawyer. He's also very handsome and very charming, and the two just kind of start hanging out. You know, as friends. This goes so bad. This goes so bad, y'all. Now we're going to talk about Carrie. Carrie, to me, is one of the most tragic characters in the Dollanganger series. Her years in the attic destroyed her self-esteem. She thinks she's ugly and evil and that no one will ever love her. She's also tormented by her mother's rejection of them and surviving when Corey didn't. Her time at boarding school was filled with constant bullying and torment. She even gets locked in an attic of all places by a group of girls and ends up breaking her leg trying to get out, which is why she ends up leaving the boarding school and coming home to finish school. She is desperate to be loved and feels like she doesn't deserve to be loved. This is taken advantage of, we learn later, by Julian when she came to visit them in New York City and he assaulted her. Scumbag. Things start looking up when she meets a boy named Alex, and the two begin dating, and then Alex drops the bomb that he wants to be a minister. Carrie thinks that she can't be a minister's wife because she's devil's spawn and devil's issue. All that horrible crap that Olivia used to tell them. And then she runs into Corinne on the street, and she's so happy to see her mother, but Corinne rejects her, and even goes so far as to pretend she doesn't know Carrie. And I think this rejection is what pushes her over the edge. She's convinced that she's so evil that even her own mother doesn't want her, and she doesn't deserve love, and that she should have died with Corey. So Carrie goes and buys some powdered sugar donuts and covers them in arsenic and starts eating them until eventually she succumbs to the same poisoning that killed her twin brother all those years ago. Mama had started all of this. Mama who got out of everything scot-free, and rich, rich, rich. All she had to do was shed a few tears of self-pity after she went home. That's when I screamed. I know I screamed, I wailed, and wanted to rip the hair from my head and tear the skin from my face. For I looked too much like this woman who had to pay, and then pay some more. His death only further spurs on Cathy's need for revenge. She becomes obsessed with making Corinne pay for what she did to them, and how they've continued to struggle. Starts seeing Bart romantically, who assaults her on their first date, because, say it with me everyone, all the men in Cathy's life are trash, but they get together nonetheless. And it's from Bart that Cathy learns, and we learn, that Corinne is not as unaffected by losing her kids as we might have thought. She goes on these crying jags while looking at an old album that she keeps locked in a safe. She remodeled Foxworth Hall from top to bottom and has forbid anyone from ever going near the attic. She also learns that Olivia suffered a severe stroke and can no longer speak or walk and is largely bedbound. Cathy decides to pay Olivia a visit. Bart never stops talking, so she knows the schedules of the staff at Foxworth Hall and the schedule of the in-home caregivers who take care of Olivia, and she still has the wooden key that Chris made, so she pretty easily gets into the house and comes face to face with Olivia, who jailed and tormented and beat and starved and poisoned her and her siblings. But this isn't the Olivia from her nightmares. She's frail and sick and can't move or speak, and Cathy can't help but feel pity for her, yet she does not let herself. Oh, and how old she looked. So gaunt, so much smaller. Where was the giantess I used to know? Why wasn't she wearing the gray taffeta dress to whisper threats? Why did she have to look so pitiful? I hardened my heart, closed out mercy, for she'd never had any for us. Cathy finally confronts Olivia. She tells her that she hates her, that she's responsible for not just Corey's death, but Carrie's as well. And there is a catharsis in that, but she didn't come here just to have it out with Olivia. She's here for revenge. So Cathy takes out her own switch and beats Olivia with it. She beats her really badly with it. And then she takes a candle and pours hot wax on her head and what little hair she has left. And while Cathy feels no pity for Olivia, This doesn't bring her the closure that she expected it to. Later tells Cathy about the horrible effect that this visit has had on Olivia's continuing declining health, and she does very much feel pity for what she's done. Bart also is spending a lot more time with Cathy and Jory, and he loves hanging out with her son, and tells her that he always wanted kids, but he and Corinne couldn't have them. So can you guess what Cathy does? Did you guess get pregnant? Yeah. Does she do this purposefully or was it on accident? Honestly, I think it could go either way. And Corinne has also returned from yet another trip to Europe, but Bart doesn't break off the affair. So Cathy feels that she's won. This feeling is only compounded when she and Jory run into Corinne at the post office, and Corinne doesn't outright ignore them because Jory, who is a super sweet, super friendly kid, is really interested in her because she looks like an older version of his mom, and Corinne actually tears up at the sight of her grandson, which does give Cathy some satisfaction. Revenge is starting to come to fruition. However, when Chris comes to visit and realizes what's going on, not the full extent, but that Cathy has been seeing Bart, he's absolutely horrified and begs her to let this go. But she can't. Neither of them can move on. Chris because he can't be with anyone but Cathy, and Cathy because she is so blinded by her desire for revenge. Them actually end up having a brief falling out because of this. However, things hit a snag when Cathy tells Bart that she's pregnant, and he doesn't end up leaving Corinne the way that she expected him to. Because even though he wants to be a father and promises that he will be one to Cathy's baby and to Jory, as well as support them financially, he does genuinely love Corinne, and he's not going to leave her. That's when we enter Plan C. Dress custom made to look exactly like the one her mother wore to the Christmas party where Malcolm welcomed her back home, get her hair done exactly the same way, and crash the current Christmas party looking exactly like Corinne did that night. I love mess, so I was living for this. Cathy sneaks back into Foxworth Hall, waits until midnight Cinderella style, and then descends the grand staircase, loudly announcing that she's Corinne's secret daughter, the oldest of 4 secret children by her half-uncle that Corinne kept locked away in an attic and then tried to kill for her inheritance. And the party, understandably, erupts in chaos. So a horrified Bart gets Corinne, Cathy, and takes them to the library where Olivia is and demands an explanation. Because, excuse my language, as crazy as this shit sounds, Cathy looks a lot like Corinne. And how did she know what the dress looked like? How did she know what her hair looked like? Corinne, of course, denies everything, and Olivia can't speak, but surprise, Cathy has their birth certificates. Remember Corinne left those behind when she and Bart left at the end of Flowers in the Attic? Yeah, Cathy kept those. And Bart is horrified by this. And Corinne immediately tries to blame Malcolm, who she claims knew about the kids the entire time and that he told her to lock the kids up. But Bart shuts that down because Malcolm doted on her. And even if he did tell her to do it, that's not an excuse for what Corinne did. Finally, after all this time, after all these years, Corinne admits the truth. Full disclosure, the section I'm going to read is long, but it's relevant, but it is long. I didn't want to love you, Bart, and involve you in the mess I was in. I wanted to tell you about my children and the threat my father posed to them. Just when I would, he would worsen and appear ready to die, so I'd put it off and keep quiet. I prayed that when I eventually did tell you, you'd understand. It was stupid of me, for a secret kept too long becomes impossible to explain. You wanted to marry me. My father kept saying no. My children pleaded to be let out. Even though I knew they had every right to complain, I began to resent them and the way they kept harassing me, making me feel guilty and ashamed when I was trying to do the best I could for them. And it was Cathy. It was always Cathy. No matter how many gifts I gave her, who kept at it the most. She threw me another one of her long tormented looks, as if I'd tortured her beyond endurance. Cathy, she whispered then, her watery, drowning look of anguish brightening a little as once more she turned to me. I did the best I could. I told my parents all of you had hidden afflictions, especially Corey. They wanted to think God had punished my children, so they believed easily. And Corey was always having one cold or another in his allergy. Can't you see what I tried to do? Make all of you just a little sick, so I could rush you to the hospital and report back to my mother that you had died. I used a minute bit of arsenic, not enough to kill you. All I wanted to do was make you a little sick, just enough to get you out. Is any of what Corinne said true? Was Malcolm actually the mastermind behind everything and her poisoning the kids just a desperate, albeit very stupid, plan to save them? Honestly, in my opinion, and canonically speaking, because in Garden of Shadows we learn quite a bit more about the circumstances that lead to the kids' imprisonment. Garden of Shadows is a prequel novel to the Dollenganger series that is told from Olivia's point of view that we're going to talk about in the distant-ish future. But like I said, in Garden of Shadows we learn a little bit more about the circumstances of the kids' imprisonment. So canonically speaking, no, this is a lie. And I genuinely think what Corinne is saying here about Malcolm is a lie. Don't think that Corinne planned to poison the kids just a little bit to save them. I genuinely think that she learned about the condition of her inheritance and then straight up tried to kill them. And Corinne is unraveling at this point, and Bart is losing it. So naturally it is at this point that Chris shows up. He came to get Cathy because Henny had a massive stroke and sadly passed away. She'd been having, pretty significant health issues the last few years and had gotten worse, and she has sadly passed away. And Paul ended up having a massive heart attack while he was trying to help her. And he is now in critical condition and might not survive the night. And so they have to leave right now. And Paul says he's going with them. He's finished with Corinne. And the sight of Chris is the straw that breaks the camel's back. Because while Cathy looks just like Corinne, Chris looks exactly like their father. And Corinne has a complete mental breakdown, believing that he is the ghost of Christopher who's come back to punish her for what she did to their kids. She asked, "Chris, I didn't mean to do it. Really, I didn't. Don't look at me like that, Chris. I loved them. I didn't want to give them the arsenic, but my father made me. He told me they should have never been born. He tried to tell me they were so evil they deserved to die, and the only way that I could make amends for the sin I'd committed when I married you." Streamed down her cheeks as she went on, though Chris kept shaking his head. "I loved my children, our children, but what could I do? I only meant to make them just a little sick, just enough to save them. That's all. Chris, don't look at me like that. You know, I wouldn't have killed our children." His eyes turned icy blue as he stared at her. "Then why did you deliberately feed us arsenic?" he asked. "I never fully believed it once we were free of this house and had time to think about it. But you did do it." She screamed then. And all my life, I'd never heard such a scream as the one that rose and fell hysterically. As you can see, despite her excuses, Chris offers her no forgiveness and no absolution. And Corinne runs off, and she actually runs to the attic and sets the house on fire. It is absolute mayhem as people try to escape the house, which thankfully everyone does, except for Olivia, who Bart goes back into to save, and they both end up dying in the fire. And Corinne is confined to a mental health facility not long after this. So, in a way, Cathy got her revenge, but at what cost? And again, this does not bring her the peace that she hoped. She feels devastated and guilty for what happened. Chris, Cathy, and Jory return to Paul's, where Paul and Cathy, who survived the heart attack but is still in very fragile health, finally end up getting married. Cathy gives birth to her and Bart's child, who she names Bart after his father. It is 1973 at this point. Bart is given Paul's last name, however, so he is Bart Sheffield. Put a pin in that. And they live together happily for about 3 years, but Paul is getting sicker and tells Cathy that when he dies, she should be with Chris, and that they should raise her sons together, since the kids will be too young to remember him, and they won't remember Chris as their uncle. And when Paul dies in 1976, that's exactly what they do. Chris has been using the name Sheffield for many, many years at this point, and both Jory and Bart took Paul's last name, Sheffield, when he and Cathy got married. So they become the Sheffields. The four of them, Chris, Cathy, Jory, and Bart, move across the country to California, where they live as husband and wife, raising Cathy's sons together. And this, again, is just so horribly sad to me, because despite how seemingly perfect things are, they're both successful. Chris is a doctor and Cathy is a sought-after ballet teacher. Their sons are happy and they live in a beautiful house. Cathy lives in constant fear that their secret will be revealed, to the point where during a dissociative episode, which she has occasionally, Kathy goes up to the attic and gets it ready with 2 beds and even gets a giant picnic basket, just like the grandmother had, just in case she has to hide her kids away should their secret be exposed. For your reference is the final paragraph in Petals on the Wind. So I go uneasily to bed and lay there awake, fearing the worst in myself and struggling to keep firm hold of the best. It seems as I turn over and snuggle closer to the man I love that I can hear the cold wind blowing from the blue misted mountains so far away. It's the past that I can never forget that shadows all my days and hides furtively in corners when Chris is home. I do make an effort to be like he is, always optimistic, when I am not at all the kind who can forget the tarnish on the reverse side of the brightest coin. But I'm not like her. I may look like her, but inside I'm honorable, I'm stronger, more determined. The best in me will win out in the end. I know it will. It has to sometimes, doesn't it? Oh, one of my favorite series of all time is A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin, which, as you know, gave us Game of Thrones and my favorite show, Keeping Up with the Targaryens. And one of many lines from it that has stuck with me is something that Tyrion Lannister says in A Storm of Swords, which is book 3 in the series. It goes back and back, Tyrion thought, to our mothers and fathers and theirs before them. We are puppets dancing on the strings of those who came before us, and one day our own children will take up the strings and dance in our steeds. I think that line really succinctly sums up the end of Petals on the Wind and kind of gives us a hint of where we're going from here. Despite their seemingly idyllic lives, Chris and Kathy are still trapped in that cycle of generational trauma. They are the puppets on the strings of their parents that came before them. They are still trapped in this never-ending cycle. And now their children are trapped in that cycle too. And it's going to affect them as well. Thanks so much for listening to all that. It seems like I've been talking for a really, really long time. And my God, that was a lot. And I also just wanted to say thank you. Like, seriously, thank you. There's so many of you here now, and I'm still not sure what to do with that information, but thank you. Thanks so much for being here. And until next time, stay healthy, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.